Urgent! Syrsky has made a bold statement. The AFU is seizing the initiative and the Kremlin's plans are crumbling. The occupiers can no longer advance as they did before. The intensity of Russian attacks has dropped sharply and Ukrainian troops are increasingly forcing the fight themselves. And this has been visible on the front for some time. The AFU has launched counterattacks in the south and begun pushing the occupiers out of their positions. The Russians are losing logistics, fuel, ammunition, and the ability to hold captured lines. In effect, the balance of power is starting to shift. Is the Russian offensive truly stalling? I'll tell you in just a moment. Greetings, I'm Solomia Dolik. This is Ukraine Today and the latest events. The Russians are losing momentum. Syrsky reported a sharp drop in occupier activity on the front. According to him, the intensity of the Russian army's actions has already decreased by about a third.
Enemy activity has decreased significantly. I wouldn't say by half, but definitely by 1/3.
He stated, changes are visible not only in the number of attacks but also in the geography of combat. While Russian troops previously conducted active offensives in 13 directions simultaneously, now only 7 remain and only 4 of those can be considered primary.
If you look at the number of daily assault actions, it remains high, averaging from 240 to 260 per day. However, nearly 45% and sometimes up to 50% of them are offensive actions by Ukrainian units.
In fact, this indicates a significant change in the situation on the battlefield. While Russia previously mostly dictated the pace of combat, now Ukrainian troops are increasingly setting the terms and conducting active counterattacks. Another telling signal, according to Syrsky, is the reduction in the size of the Russian grouping. Currently, according to Ukrainian command estimates, there are about 722,000 Russian troops in Ukraine, including the operational reserve. And this figure is already lower than before. Despite the enemy still having significant resources and continuing attacks, the latest assessments from the AFU commander show the Russian army is gradually losing its offensive momentum, while Ukrainian forces are increasingly seizing the initiative on the battlefield. And it seems the commander-in-chief's words are confirmed by events directly on the battlefield. While the Russian army loses momentum, the AFU is increasingly seizing the initiative, particularly in one of the toughest sectors, the south. The AFU has already moved to counterattacks. Ukrainian troops are expanding so-called gray zones, reclaiming tactical positions, and forcing Russian troops to retreat. This was reported by the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Syrsky. According to him, these successes were made possible by systematic strikes on the occupiers' logistics, warehouses, transport routes, and energy infrastructure.
However, I want to note, without going into detail, that in the southern operational zone, the defense forces have now resumed activity and counter-attacking measures. We have some successes, there's an expansion of gray zones, and also the recovery of our tactical positions, driving the enemy from their current positions where they are located. And this is exactly what is happening actively now in the southern operational zone.
The hottest sector of the Zaporizhzhia direction remains the Huliai Pole area. It is there that the Russians are trying to regain positions lost in the spring, but they are increasingly facing serious problems. According to Bratchuk, the occupiers lack fuel, ammunition, weapons, and even personnel, as Ukrainian strikes have significantly complicated their supply through the occupied territories of Kherson and Crimea. At the same time, trying to compensate for losses, Russia is increasingly using guided aerial bombs and intensifying terror against the civilian population, particularly in Zaporizhzhia and Odessa. Despite this, the Ukrainian military continues to gradually improve its positions. In particular, successful actions by the defense forces have already yielded results in the Stepnohirsk area, where Russian units have suffered setbacks.
The Kremlin's main problem today is the clash between propaganda and reality. While Russian generals draw new successes on maps and the TV promises another breakthrough every day, completely different figures are accumulating at the front: losses, logistical problems, and the ever-increasing cost of every kilometer. That is why Moscow so desperately needs pretty pictures and loud victories for their reports. However, lately, these triumphs increasingly live only until the moment they collide with reality. It seems Russian propaganda can capture settlements much faster than the Russian army. Details on all of this are coming up in the report. In Russia, they've already invented a new kind of military victory. Run in, wave a flag in front of the camera, and you can report a successful offensive to Putin. However, this time the show ended much faster than the Russian propagandists could enjoy their own headlines. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, the occupiers solemnly announced the alleged capture of Novoselivka and Hulyapilske, and propagandists have already started talking about another major breakthrough by the Russian army. However, this entire grand operation fit into a short video and a few loud headlines. The scenario was simple. A group of Russian stormtroopers ran to the outskirts of the settlements, unfurled the tricolor, recorded the necessary footage, and were clearly already preparing to receive applause from their superiors. In Moscow offices, they were probably already opening champagne, and propaganda channels were rushing to paint another historical victory. Except that between the video and the actual situation at the front, a small problem arose once again: reality. As soon as the cameras turned off, a completely different story began. Ukrainian drones targeted the liberators, and the loud victory performance instantly turned into an operation to eliminate its participants. One of the occupiers, who just minutes ago was posing with a flag for Russian news, ended up in Ukrainian captivity. This is already becoming the signature style of the Russian army. First paint a victory, and only after that face what is actually happening on the battlefield. While Kremlin propagandists count imaginary successes, the Ukrainian military counts quite real results of their work. And the louder Moscow shouts about its triumphs, the more often it turns out that this entire victory ended even before the editing of the propaganda story was finished. And this is far from the only case when the Russian authorities arrange a substitution of reality with beautiful fairy tales. Putin himself personally joined this process. During his latest statements, he painted an incredibly rosy picture of the Russian offensive. However, the facts and frontline maps say otherwise. The master of the Kremlin stated that in the Lyman area, the occupiers only have 149 houses left to liberate out of more than 11,000. Sounds formidable, but the problem is that most of the city remains under the control of the defense forces, and Russian assault groups only occasionally seep into certain areas of the eastern part of the city. In other words, the distance between Putin's words and reality is no less than between Kremlin dreams and their actual result. No less interesting are the statements about Sloviansk and Sumy. The Kremlin says that Russian troops have only 8 to 9 kilometers left to Sloviansk, although the actual distance is about twice as much. With Sumy, the situation is no better. Putin talks about 10 kilometers to the city, while in reality it's about 17 to 20 kilometers, and the front line there has hardly changed for months. Especially fantastic was the story about the alleged breakthrough of the impregnable Ukrainian defense line near Dobropilya. Putin even hurried to announce that there are almost no Ukrainian fortifications behind the city. However, in practice, Russian units are still tens of kilometers away from the lines he is talking about. It turns out that the Kremlin is already celebrating overcoming the defense that its troops haven't even reached yet. And the real gem was the statement about the almost completed encirclement of a large Ukrainian grouping near Rubtsy. According to Putin, only a few kilometers remain until the circle is complete. However, even a basic look at the map shows that there are still about 10 kilometers between the Russian positions and the area that is supposedly on the verge of encirclement. It seems the Russian leadership has long been fighting on two fronts at once. On one real front, where progress comes at a huge cost and doesn't always bring results. On the second, television front, where you can capture cities, encircle armies, and break through defenses with one move of a pointer on a map. And while propaganda counts invented kilometers and non-existent victories, the front continues to stubbornly remind the Kremlin that reality works a bit differently. However, speaking of Russian fantasies, the story of the flag in Zaporizhzhia or Putin's latest claims of a successful offensive is just a small episode in a much larger play. Actually, the Kremlin's been painting a victory over Donbas for 4 years now, and every time the result is the same. Loud promises, stern deadlines, and yet another postponement of the dates. The president of Ukraine also took note of this. According to Zelensky, since the full-scale war began, Russian leaders have set a date for capturing the Donetsk region at least 15 times.
Russia's political leadership is constantly obsessed with Donbas. 15 times already they've had this delusion that they would completely seize Donbas. In 2022, the deadlines were March 31st, then May 9th, June 1st, September 15th, and December 31st. In 2023, Putin set 2 more deadlines for the capture of Donbas by March 1st. And then, when it failed again, they moved it to December 31st. In 2024, there were 2 such deadlines again. In 2025, when the Russians tried to convince President Trump that Ukraine would supposedly fall, there were already 3 deadlines by September 1st, December 1st, and December 25th.
After such a list, it's hard to understand what exactly Russia's main military operation is. Assaults on the front line or the regular postponement of deadlines? It seems the only thing the occupiers have managed to take full control of over these years is their own calendar. They've captured Donbas so many times that they should have reached not just Kramatorsk but Mars by now. But every time, stubborn reality shattered the Kremlin's presentations. It looks especially funny that even in 2026, this performance continues. At first, Moscow dreamed of closing the Donetsk issue by March 31st, then the deadline was quietly pushed to September 1st. Now the new milestone is December 31st. And there's little doubt that if nothing really changes, by the end of the year, Russian propaganda will solemnly announce yet another near victory, one that, as usual, just has to be postponed a little bit longer.
If Russia doesn't end its war, they'll have to postpone this deadline once again. If Putin wants to sacrifice another million soldiers to keep hitting this wall, then the million Russians not yet drafted, who are arguing in gas lines, should think about what's next for them.
And here's the main question. If in 4.5 years of war, the Kremlin has almost captured Donbas 15 times, hasn't this become the largest series of broken promises in modern military history? While Russian officials draw new arrows on maps and invent new dates for victories, the front stubbornly reminds them of one unpleasant thing. The gap between the television and reality is becoming wider and wider. Moscow increasingly resembles a city that the war has finally reached. Drones regularly break through to the capital, strategic sites are burning, and Muscovites seek shelter at night, waking up to explosions. And most interestingly, at this very same time, the Kremlin continues to convince the country that everything is under control. But the more strikes occur in Russia, the louder the air defense works over residential areas, and the more often new crises arise, the harder it is to hide the obvious. Reality is increasingly painfully breaking into the world that Putin has built for Russians for years out of television illusions. Details in the report next. Moscow can no longer pretend that the war is somewhere far away. What for years was shown to Russians on TV as someone else's trouble suddenly started knocking on the windows of the country's most expensive districts. The capital, accustomed to living in the confidence that it is protected by the most modern air defense systems and an endless military budget, faced a very unpleasant reality. Drones arrive again and again, and residents increasingly wake up not to alarm clocks, but to explosions and rumbling in the sky. What especially worries Muscovites is that at the critical moment, silence falls. Sirens are silent, warnings do not arrive. People learn about the danger only when the characteristic sound of engines is heard over houses or when anti-aircraft systems start working in the sky. And this is exactly where the main question arises. If the capital of the world's largest country has come under attack, why haven't the authorities yet explained basic safety rules to the citizens? It turned out that Moscow, which for decades was presented as the center of a powerful superpower, is absolutely not ready for life under an aerial threat. People independently search for shelter maps, exchange addresses in chats and forums, call officials, and try to understand where to run in case of a new attack. But instead of clear answers, they often get a bureaucratic labyrinth. In some districts, information is hidden. In others, they advise coming to the administrations in person. One gets the impression that finding a safe place in the capital is much harder than finding another propaganda story about full control over the situation. Meanwhile, the sky over Moscow itself is increasingly becoming a source of fear. Russian air defense, which for years was demonstrated at parades as a symbol of invincibility, is forced to work right over residential areas. Debris falls to the ground, explosions ring out near houses, and residents watch all this from balconies and courtyards. This looks especially telling against the backdrop of the Kremlin's long-standing claims about the absolute safety of the capital. Even more indignation is caused by the reaction of the authorities after the attacks. Instead of explaining to people how to act during danger, officials and security structures focus on fighting information. Publications of photos and videos of strikes become a greater irritant for the system than the strikes themselves. It seems that the main task remains not the protection of the population, but the preservation of the image of calm on television screens. Against this background, the gap between ordinary Muscovites and the top of the Russian government becomes especially noticeable. While some in the middle of the night take their children to bathrooms away from windows and try to understand where to find shelter, others continue to live behind the high fences of closed residences. For ordinary residents, the attacks have become a part of everyday life. For the political elite, they still remain something distant, existing only in reports and press releases. And at the same time, Moscow demonstrates a strange contrast. In one part of the city, people read news about new strikes, check neighbor chats, and listen to every unusual sound. In another, social events, loud presentations, and parties continue, as if someone is persistently trying to prove that nothing is happening. But each new attack shatters this illusion even more. Today, the main fear of Muscovites is not the drones themselves. What scares them most is the realization that the system, which promised absolute protection for years, turned out to be unprepared for the test. And every time after new explosions in the capital, more and more people ask themselves the same question. If the authorities cannot guarantee safety in the very heart of Russia, then how truthful were all the other promises of the Kremlin? And in the Kremlin, they haven't even changed the record. There, it seems, exists some parallel reality where oil depots don't burn, fuel shortages don't occur, and drones reaching the Russian capital have no impact at all. This is exactly the picture Putin painted in another conversation with court propagandist Zarubin. While the whole country sees regular strikes on strategic targets, the Russian president assures all means of protection are in place, the system works, and the problems are not critical. If translated from Kremlin speak to human language, it goes something like this: there's not enough gasoline, but there's no shortage. Facilities are burning, but there's almost no damage. Drones arrive, but they have no impact whatsoever. It seems the main task of the Russian authorities today is not to solve the problem, but to convince the population that the problem doesn't exist. Even the fuel crisis the Kremlin is actually trying to present as an element of a Ukrainian information operation. Queues at gas stations are not a shortage. Supply disruptions are not a problem. Strikes on energy infrastructure are nothing serious. Everything works stably and with a large margin of safety, at least in words. However, the longer this performance lasts, the harder it is to hide the obvious. If all defense systems work perfectly, then why do Moscow residents wake up from explosions? If the strikes don't matter, then why do the authorities react so nervously to every video of an impact? If the fuel situation is under control, then why publicly explain to the population at all that stocks will last for a few more days? But the most ambitious part of the speech wasn't even the stories about the economy or air defense. Putin spoke again about major offensives, future conquests, and victories. From the Kremlin offices, everything looks extremely simple. Only a few kilometers left to one city, even less to another. A little more and another Ukrainian defense will supposedly crumble. There is only one inconvenient detail in these statements. The Russian leadership has been repeating most of these forecasts for many months, and in some cases, years. The more difficulties accumulate within Russia itself, the more grandiose the promises from TV screens become. While Muscovites search for bomb shelters, they're told about future seizures of new territories. While regions face fuel shortages, they're told that the enemy is about to be surrounded. While drones reach strategic targets, they're shown a picture of absolute control. And this is exactly where Russia's main paradox lies today. The real country increasingly faces the consequences of war. The televised country continues to live in a world of endless victories, breakthroughs, and grand plans. And the wider the gap between these two realities, the louder the Kremlin must repeat its favorite phrase: everything is under control. In the south, a real nightmare is beginning for the occupiers. What was called a reliable rear yesterday is falling apart right before their eyes. Logistics are crumbling, key routes are under threat, and the word evacuation is heard louder where they dreamed of a new offensive just yesterday. The Russian command is feverishly patching holes and trying to save a situation that is increasingly spiraling out of control. So what's happening in the south, and why could this become a major problem for the occupiers? Watch more in our report. Very unpleasant times are beginning for the Russian army in the south. While Kremlin propaganda continues to talk about a stable front and more fantastic successes, reality increasingly forces the occupiers to pack up and seek retreat routes. Ukrainian forces are methodically taking out Russian logistics, leaving enemy garrisons without supplies. And where threats of an offensive were heard just yesterday, they're already discussing evacuation today. It seems a new phase of a gesture of goodwill has begun for the Russian military on the Kinburn Spit. After months of loud claims about controlling the coast, the occupiers suddenly faced a harsh reality. Without food, water, fuel, and ammunition, even the loudest propaganda doesn't help much. Ukrainian drones have methodically turned Russian logistics into a survival game where every attempt to deliver cargo increasingly ends in a one-way trip. According to the Ukrainian military, supplies to the Kinburn Spit are almost paralyzed. What the Kremlin recently called a reliable bridgehead increasingly resembles a cut-off patch of land from which personnel must be hastily evacuated. Even partisans are reporting a partial withdrawal of Russians from several positions. It's a rather symbolic picture. Capturing the territory turned out to be much easier than holding it under constant strikes. And while the occupiers on the Kinburn Spit think about how to evacuate the remnants of their units, Russian logistics problems only multiply. It seems that lately all roads leading to Crimea have suddenly become a source of a massive headache for the Russian command. Another alarming signal for the occupiers came from the Arabat Spit area, one of the most important routes used to supply the Russian grouping in the south. Crimean social media reports a strike on the bridge between Henikesk and the Arabat Spit, and satellite data cited by the Crimean Wind Monitoring Group recorded fires in areas where Russian troops are stationed. Judging by the reaction of the occupation administration, the situation turned out to be much more serious than they wanted to show. Collaborator Vladimir Saldo was forced to admit the strike and report the closure of the crossing. Later, the occupation authorities began to reassure the population, claiming that traffic would be partially restored, but the bridge needs repair. When, after successful air defense work, a strategic crossing has to be urgently repaired, it already looks like a rather telling result. For the Kremlin, the problem is not just the bridge itself. Every such strike gradually destroys the entire supply system of Russian troops in the south. If before the occupiers could relatively calmly move equipment, fuel, and ammunition through numerous routes, now these routes are becoming fewer and fewer. And the more such bottlenecks appear on the map, the closer the prospect that Moscow fears most becomes, turning Crimea and the adjacent occupied territories into a logistical trap for its own army. However, the most telling thing is not even the attack on the Arabat Spit itself, but Russia's reaction to the threat of Ukrainian strikes. It seems the Kremlin understands perfectly how vulnerable their logistics have become, and so they are feverishly trying to protect the most valuable transport facility of the occupied south, the Crimean Bridge. Updated satellite images show a rather telling picture. Around the crossing over the Kerch Strait, the Russians have effectively built an entire defense complex. Barges, boom barriers, anti-sabotage structures, additional defensive lines in the water. It seems the bridge is being prepared not for normal operation, but for a siege. And a siege that Moscow clearly fears very much. The contrast between the official statements of Russian propaganda and the actual actions of the occupiers looks especially funny. Wow. They're bringing it, boys, they're bringing it. From TV screens, Russians have been told for years that the situation is under full control and all attacks are supposedly successfully repelled. They're bringing reinforcements. Look, what reinforcements? However, if everything is so good, then why turn the main transport artery to Crimea into a floating fortified area surrounded by protection on all sides? In fact, the answer is obvious. The Crimean Bridge remains critically important for supplying Russian troops on the occupied peninsula. And every new strike on logistics only increases the nervousness in the Kremlin. Because when you have to build a multi-layered defense system around one bridge, it shows not confidence in your own strength, but an increasing fear of losing the last reliable artery connecting occupied Crimea with Russian territory. And while Russian generals try to patch holes in logistics around Crimea, unpleasant news for the occupiers comes from another direction. On the Donetsk-Mariupol highway, which remains one of the key transport arteries of the Russian group, drones of the Spartan Brigade are methodically destroying enemy military transport. Russian equipment catches fire one after another, and with it, the myth of a quiet rear where one can accumulate forces and move resources with impunity burns away. Russian propagandists are increasingly complaining about strikes where they previously felt completely safe. If just a few years ago occupied Donetsk was presented as a center of a new reality far from the war, now even there Russian military personnel are forced to peer into the sky. After all, Ukrainian drones don't just see the enemy's strategic routes, they also regularly remind the occupiers that the concept of a deep rear is rapidly losing its meaning for them. However, Ukrainian strikes lately have been aimed not only at equipment and logistical routes. More and more often, objects are coming under fire, without which the Russian army simply cannot imagine conducting modern warfare. Control and training centers for drone operators. Another confirmation of this was a series of strikes on the occupiers' military facilities in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. According to the General Staff, Ukrainian forces hit a training ground for UAV operators near Debaltsev. For the Russian army, this is especially painful because drones lately have become one of the few tools that allow them to compensate for huge losses in equipment and manpower. But the occupiers' problems didn't end there. Drone control points in the areas of Mirnohrad and Perebudova, as well as command and observation posts near Pokrovsk, also came under strike. In other words, the Ukrainian military is hitting not only the drones themselves, but also the people who control them, the places of their training, and the centers from which attacks are coordinated. Ukrainian forces are no longer just delivering individual strikes on warehouses or equipment. The entire Russian military machine is coming under systemic pressure. Logistics routes, crossings, transport arteries, control points, training centers for drone operators, and even areas that were recently considered a deep rear. As a result, the Russian command is forced to simultaneously solve dozens of crises, save supplies in Crimea, repair damaged routes, look for replacements for destroyed equipment, and restore the troop control system. And the longer this trend continues, the more obvious the main conclusion becomes. For the occupiers, the problem is no longer in individual strikes, but in the fact that the entire architecture of supporting the war is gradually being destroyed. And an army that loses logistics, control, and a safe rear sooner or later begins to lose the ability to hold captured territories. And how do you feel about such events? Write your opinion in the comments, hit the like button under the video, and stay informed about the main things. More to come. And we'll see you in the next story.